Welcome to the deep dive. Okay, so for 94 previous deep dives, we've really spent, well, countless hours digging into the lives of the super rich, right? Their deals, their companies, their charities, their fights. We've seen them hailed as, visionaries, but also slammed as, well, monopolists. But today we're hitting pause. We're zooming out a bit to ask something, I think, pretty fundamental, maybe even philosophical. When a personal fortune gets into the billions, is it actually possible for that kind of wealth to be truly clean?
That really is the core question, isn't it? We're trying to look beyond just individual actions, individual morals, and examine the system itself. We're diving into this concept. It's something historians and economists talk about called primitive accumulation. The basic idea, and it's pretty crucial, is that every huge fortune, the kind that lasts generations, no matter how much we talk about hard work or brilliant ideas, it's ultimately built on some kind of, hidden injustice, maybe forgotten exploitation, or even an initial crime that gets papered over. It's like the foundational compromise that's baked right into extreme wealth.
Right. So our mission today, then, is to connect those dots across history. We're trying to draw a line, maybe an unbroken one, starting from those really ruthless Gilded Age monopolists, straight through the finance guys who mastered debt and, downsizing and landing right where we are now with the data barons and the crypto speculators. We want to show the sort of structural compromises that even allow this much capital to get concentrated in the first place.
Exactly. We need to see how the methods change, with the times, from like industrial sabotage and bribing politicians back then to using network effects or, algorithmic tricks today. But the underlying principle, it seems to stay the same. Concentrating capital by getting rid of competition and bending the rules, compromising the systems that are supposed to govern things.
Yeah.
So let's unpack that historical progression, starting where these fortunes really got industrialized, with those titans of the 19th century.
Okay, so the Gilded Age. When you think about the foundation of extreme modern American wealth, you pretty much have to start with John D. Rockefeller and Standard Oil. It's almost terrifying. So Standard Oil Company of Ohio, right, ticked off in 1870. Capital. $1 million. And you got to remember, that $1 million then, it's like, what, 11 million today? Maybe more? It wasn't just a big start. It was instantly huge, like a landmark. Nothing else in American business had really reached that scale before.
And the thing you see right away, it wasn't really about competing with better ideas or efficiency necessarily. It was about eliminating the market. Rockefeller himself, he was, personally quite meticulous, quiet even, but he perfected these monopolistic tactics using his subordinates. And these guys were explicitly told to be ruthless. They acted as a buffer, insulating Rockefeller's own reputation, his sort of polite public face. The source material details guys like O'Day, a key lieutenant who just used sheer economic force routinely.
Right, O'Day was the muscle, basically. The sources show him sending another guy, Archbold, to visit this producer, Murphy. And the message was simple. Standard expected to take care of his production. That wasn't an offer, was it? It sounds more like a threat. Like if Murphy didn't play ball, Standard would just cut him off, make it impossible for him to ship or sell anything.
Exactly. It was coercion dressed up as, market forces. We expect to handle your output.
And that pressure, it wasn't just aimed at small guys like Murphy. It went right up to the railroads, the really powerful players back then.
Absolutely. There's this incident where a railway official complained that Standard Oil was basically hogging all the crude oil shipments, which is clearly anti-competitive, right? O'Day didn't even bother denying it. He just shot back that, maybe Standard would just decide to ship all its refined oil by pipeline instead, just bypass the railroads completely. And he was proud of it. He actually reported back to Rockefeller almost gleefully that he could hold this pipeline threat over the railroad bosses as a club. It shows they knew exactly what they were doing. Their sheer size wasn't just an advantage, it was a weapon against the entire system.
But didn't Rockefeller always argue, even later, that, okay, maybe they were tough, but that ruthless efficiency, it ultimately helped consumers, right? Drove down the price of kerosene and stuff. How do the sources square that supposed public benefit with the kind of, brutal tactics O'Day was using?
Well, the sources suggest Rockefeller's real genius was maybe in his strategic silence. While his guys were out there cracking heads, figuratively speaking, he stayed quiet publicly. When the critics, the muckrakers, started attacking Standard Oil, he just didn't engage. He ignored the slanderers. His belief, apparently, was that history would prove him right, because he was just focused on extending and developing and perfecting our business. That was his line. And that's the paradox, isn't it? What Standard Oil really showed was that free markets, if you leave them totally alone, no regulation. they don't necessarily lead to more competition. They tend, quite aggressively, towards monopoly, which is exactly why, eventually, the system had to react. It demanded antitrust laws to put some limits on that power.
Okay, let's shift to Andrew Carnegie. He seems like the first one who really tried to build a moral case for this massive concentration of wealth, provided, it was given back eventually. Philanthropy. He had this idea that the gap between rich and poor wasn't just random, it was inevitable, governed by, like, iron laws.
Yeah, he basically made the argument that, look, this new industrial system, okay, it creates huge inequality, but it also makes goods so incredibly cheap and in such huge quantities that even the poor could now enjoy what the rich could not before afford. Access to cheap stuff, that was his main justification for the hierarchy it created. And central to this was what you could call the talent premium. This idea that leaders, the guys with this special talent for organization and management, they just had to be highly recompensed.
And that meant, crucially, that they ended up with more revenue that can be judiciously expended upon themselves.
Right. So the sheer fact that they accumulated more money than they could possibly spend, that was kind of built in, necessary even, which then conveniently created the moral obligation for them to become philanthropists later on. Precisely. But his commitment to accumulating capital, it was intense. So intense, it often overruled loyalty to his own partners. Carnegie insisted the company had to reinvest up to 75% of profits back into the business, always improving, always expanding capacity, staying ahead globally. And this meant he basically ignored pleas from his partners, guys like Harry Phipps, who just wanted bigger cash dividends. They wanted to actually enjoy the wealth they were helping create.
Yeah, Phipps had that famous line, didn't he? Comparing their situation to the man without a country, always seeing the riches, but never allowed to actually, land and enjoy them. Carnegie put the empire's growth first, ahead of the people closest to him, which shows this fundamental split between personal wealth and the drive for industrial capital to just keep growing itself.
And then rounding out this early group, you've got Cornelius Vanderbilt. His fortune wasn't just about industry. It was built through constant financial and, frankly, political battles. His whole career reads like a series of aggressive fights.
Even early on, you see that ruthlessness. The sources talk about how he pushed his own son-in-law, this guy Allen, pushed him to sell Vanderbilt's steamships to the accessory transit company for, $1.1 million. Even though Allen thought the company's own charter actually forbade the deal, Vanderbilt just steamrolled him, didn't care about the legal details as they got in the way of profit.
And by 1870, his power in railroads led to this really audacious move, consolidating the New York Central and Hudson River Railroad. This created one of the biggest corporations America had ever seen. And he capitalized the stock at this absolutely mind-blowing figure, $90 million. The sources say it just astounded the public. Nobody had seen numbers like that.
And that number, that $90 million, it wasn't all real value, was it? It was largely puffed up through massive stock increases, like 85% for one line, 27% for the other. It was financial engineering on a grand scale. And the payoff was immediate and huge. That first semi-annual dividend, $3.6 million, which back then was the biggest single dividend ever paid out by anyone. Corporation, state, didn't matter.
That's the takeaway from that whole era, really. The foundations of these great fortunes. They were built on, economic coercion, bending financial rules, and just raw, unchecked power. They set the template, didn't they? That extreme wealth often requires crushing your rivals and being willing to ignore or just rewrite the rules of the game.
Okay, so if the Gilded Age guys figured out how to bend the market, the next wave learned how to bend the state, how to control the rules themselves. Robert Moses in New York, he feels like the absolute masterclass in this, the power broker who mixed public office with these sort of private authorities he created.
Yeah, Moses is kind of terrifying in how systematic he was. He literally wrote the laws that created the public authorities he then ran, like the Triborough Bridge and Tunnel Authority. And those laws had this really clever and ultimately crippling little clause in them. It said that if the authority made more money than expected, which they did, very quickly from tolls and fees, that extra revenue could only be used for one thing, paying off the bonds faster. It couldn't be touched by the city for anything else. Not for schools, not for hospitals, not even for, say, fixing the subways.
That sounds almost responsible, doesn't it? Paying down debt quickly. What's wrong with that?
Well, on the surface, maybe, but the practical effect. It made the city of New York completely dependent on Moses, permanently. He controlled all this revenue, all this engineering power through his authorities. The city itself had no independent money or means to push back or propose alternatives, like investing in mass transit instead of more highways.
It was like a weaponized budget constraint.
Exactly. It was the ultimate systemic club, just like O'Day's pipeline threat. If city officials even dared to suggest, hey, maybe we should put some of this money into subways instead of another parkway, Moses could just threaten to pull the plug, withdraw the funding entirely. So public works got built where he wanted, how he wanted. He used his legal authority against the democratic government that was supposed to be overseeing him. He made sure the infrastructure served his vision, not necessarily what the broader public might have needed or wanted.
Wow. Okay, let's shift gears, go global, to Asia, where this mix of political and economic power gets kind of formalized in what people call crony capitalism, the Asian godfathers. This wasn't just a few bad apples, right? It was more structural.
Oh, absolutely. It was deeply rooted in a specific feature of the regional economy back then, this incredibly high savings rate. At its peak, the regional savings rate was near like 40%, just astounding. All this domestic saving meant there was this huge flood of cheap money washing around in the financial system. And that money, it got systematically funneled, often through the banks, directly to politically connected politicians and their favored tycoon partners.
So the banks weren't just neutral players allocating capital efficiently. They were more like conduits for political favors.
That's a good way to put it. In the really extreme cases, places like Indonesia, the Philippines back then, the tycoons basically treated the commercial banks like their own personal piggy banks. They'd use the public savings to bankroll their own ventures, which were often pretty risky, and also to fund their political allies. Capital went where the connections were, not necessarily where the best business case was.
But even inside these tight-knit, often family-run empires, they knew they needed outside help sometimes, right?
They did. Generally, these tycoons were pretty wary of outsiders, especially Westerners, guaylos. But some were sharp enough, like Li Ka-shing in Hong Kong, to figure out that, hey, a well-paid guaylo was just as trustworthy as an Asian if you paid them enough. So he brought in professional managers, guys like Simon Murray, to run parts of his empire. He knew he needed that expertise, even if it came from outside the traditional circle.
But when it came to outside shareholders, especially the public ones, that's where the gloves came off.
Oh, yeah. That's where you see the real ruthlessness. These tycoons routinely tried to buy back shares in their public companies on the cheap, often making offers way below what the assets were actually worth. The source mentions Robert Koch, for example. In 2003, he tried to take Kerry Properties private with an offer that was a whopping 53% discount to its net asset value.
That's basically just extracting value directly from the minority shareholders who trusted them.
Absolutely. And it wasn't a one-off. Richard Li Ka-shing's son, apparently tried a brilliantly devious attempt to privatize his mobile phone business, Sunday, also on the cheap. There's a quote in the sources from an analyst who said, "These tycoons make investment bankers look like schoolboys when it comes to pulling these kinds of lowball moves."
And the ultimate example of political favoritism seems to be Hong Kong, right after Teng Shihua became the chief executive. He had strong backing from godfathers like Li Ka-shing. And then, suddenly, government policies started looking very friendly to the tycoons.
The evidence for regulatory capture there is pretty stark, yeah. In August 98, the government made this hugely controversial move. They dumped $15 billion of Hong Kong's foreign exchange reserves into the stock market, ostensibly to stabilize it, but a lot of that money flowed directly into propping up the share prices of tycoon-controlled companies. It cushioned their assets significantly. And even more blatant was the deal Richard Li got for the Cyberport project, this huge, valuable piece of land. He was granted the rights to develop it without a public tender. That just bypassed the whole competitive process. It was an enormous gift of value directly to someone with the right connections.
So state power wasn't just protecting existing wealth. It was being actively used to create new wealth for the connected elite.
Precisely. And you see a kind of parallel dynamic, maybe wrapped in a different ideological package in the modern U.S. with figures like the Koch brothers. They effectively built what the sources call a private political bank.
Right, they weren't just donating their own millions. They were organizing other very wealthy conservatives people in the top 0.1%, that level persuading them to invest alongside them, creating this incredibly coordinated and well-funded machine for lobbying, for funding think tanks, for running ads.
And Charles Koch, he even framed this political spending as a kind of modern noblesse oblige. He used that quote from Rabbi Hillel, if not us, who? If not now, when? But the goal wasn't just, influencing policy here and there. It was more fundamental. According to the sources, Charles Koch's aim was really to tear the government out at the root. He saw government action, regulation as a fundamental obstacle to, well, wealth creation and industry.
And that opposition really came into the open after Obama was elected, didn't it? There was that full-page ad.
Yeah, paid for by the Cato Institute, which the Cox founded. It directly attacked Obama's justification for government intervention in the economy, saying flat out, with all due respect, Mr. President, that is not true.
And it wasn't just Cato saying it. It was signed by, what, over 200 people?
203 individuals, yeah. And the sources note that many of those signatories were people who received funding or support from Koch-backed foundations and organizations. It showed a really coordinated front. It confirms that for a lot of modern mega-wealth, political action shaping the rules, shaping the ideology, isn't separate from business. It's seen as a crucial, necessary part of the strategy. You have to control the rules of the game to protect and grow the fortune.
Okay, so we've seen manipulating markets, manipulating rules. Then we get to the 80s and 90s, and the focus shifts again. Now it's about optimizing the corporation itself, financializing everything. Jack Welch at GE, he's kind of the poster child for this, right?
Yeah.
Radical downsizing, shareholder value above all else.
Welch really did tear up that old post-war idea of loyalty between a company and its workers. He apparently found the very notion laughable. He brought in rank and yank, remember, forcing managers every year to identify and fire the bottom 10% of their employees. Didn't matter if a company was doing well or if the person was competent, just bottom 10%, you're out. His core belief was that a smaller workforce meant lower costs, which meant higher profits, which was great for shareholders, but it fundamentally changed the deal for American workers. That idea of a stable, long-term job, it took a massive hit.
And cutting costs was just one side of it. The other was this insane acquisition spree. GE under Welch made, what, nearly 1,000 acquisitions?
Almost 1,000, yeah. Spending something like $130 billion. And often, the goal wasn't really to build these companies up within GE. It was often to chop them up, sell off the pieces. His mantra was all about being number one or number two in every market GE was in. Fix it, close it, or sell it. Ruthless focus. The whole game shifted. It wasn't about GE's legacy as a great manufacturer anymore. It was about maximizing the stock price through financial maneuvering. And Welch himself saw the peak of that as his greatest success. In 1993, GE became the most valuable company in the world on the stock market, hitting a $100 billion market cap. He later said that was the best thing you can say about GE, that external stock market validation. It really shows how financial metrics, even at the expense of people or long-term operations, became the main measure of success in that era.
And that era also gave us the LBO, the leveraged buyout. The peak craziness there has to be the fight for RGR Nabisco. What's wild is how fast it happened and how little they seem to know about the actual business.
Yes. Oh, absolutely. And the players involved, they knew the risks they were taking, even as they plunged ahead. When Kravis and Cohen were talking about their competing bids, they were worried. They feared that a long bidding war would just drive the price up so high that whoever won would actually end up with a Pyrrhic victory. They'd be saddled with so much debt from the buyout that the company itself would be crippled.
And the key mechanism of the LBO, the really clever or maybe cynical part, is that the massive debt used to buy the company, it gets immediately loaded onto the balance sheet of the company being bought.
Exactly. The target company basically pays for its own takeover. All the risk shifts onto the asset itself, onto its employees and operations, while the financial engineers who set up the deal often walk away with huge fees relatively quickly.
And the speed meant they were flying blind sometimes.
Yeah.
There's that moment after the first bid for RJR Nabisco where Kravis supposedly asks his team, how much do we really know about this company?
Yeah. They had the annual reports, the public filings, but they hadn't been to the factories, hadn't talked to the managers running the tobacco or food businesses. They were basically buying a financial structure, a pile of debt, not really an operating company.
It feels like that whole high-pressure environment, obsessed with leverage and balance sheets, must have been ripe for, well, cutting corners, or worse.
Yeah.
Which leads us to Drexel, Burnham, Lambert, and Michael Milken.
Milken junk bond operation, I mean, it was the absolute engine room of finance in the 80s. The sources make it clear just how critical he was. When the news broke that Drexel was being investigated, the Dow Jones dropped 43 points instantly. Junk bond prices tanked. It sent shockwaves through the system. You saw the immediate fallout. Ronald Perelman, who was using Drexel financing for a hostile takeover bid for Gillette, he had to abandon it, just like that. The whole ecosystem was incredibly dependent on Milken's machine.
He'd created this situation where he could essentially force-feed product to captive clients, right? He manufactured the junk bonds, and he had this network of buyers who almost had to take them to fuel their own deals.
It was built on this combination of maybe trust among the players, but also sheer necessity. You needed Milken's bonds to play the LBO game. It wasn't always about the fundamental quality of the debt itself.
And when his influence started to fade, when the investigations heated up, the whole thing became fragile.
Extremely fragile. Drexel ended up having to buy back huge amounts of the junk paper it couldn't sell, using its own capital. Like $250 million in loans for this Farley deal. That was nearly a quarter of Drexel's entire equity. It just shows how much the system relied on Milken's continuous ability to keep the machine running, to keep placing the debt. Once that stopped, it started to collapse inward.
And that kind of edge, that information advantage, it evolves, doesn't it? We see it later with hedge funds like Stephen Cohen's SAC Capital, trying to get the black edge.
Right. Cohen hired this guy, Kenny Lissack, specifically to build contacts, to figure out how institutional research, analyst reports, actually moved stock prices in the moment.
Lissack figured out something crucial, didn't he? It wasn't just about whether the analyst report was right or wrong about the company's future.
Exactly. Lissack saw that even if a negative report on, say, IBM was factually flawed, the simple act of a respected analyst issuing an upgrade or downgrade, that alone had a powerful, immediate impact on the stock price. Just the signal itself. So Cohen wasn't necessarily trying to predict the company's long-term performance. He was trying to predict the market's reaction to information flow, getting ahead of that psychological wave. That was the edge.
Okay, fast forward to the modern tech era. The key resource now, it's not steel or oil, maybe not even pure financial leverage anymore. It's data, it's intellectual property. And the new titans, the tech billionaires, they seem just as aggressive as the Rockefellers in locking down their advantage. Bill Gates and Microsoft, that's the classic story of building a monopoly through, well, intimidation and IP battles.
Oh, the Apple showdown in '85 is the perfect example.
Yeah.
Apple was threatening to sue Microsoft over Windows, claiming copyright violation. This was a huge potential problem for Microsoft, so Gates needed leverage, and he found it in the software Apple needed from Microsoft.
He basically threatened to pull the plug on developing Excel and Word for the Mac, right? Which Apple desperately needed at that point. Their Macintosh wasn't selling well, and they needed those business applications to make it viable.
It was a brutal but brilliant countermove. He used Apple's dependence on Microsoft software as a weapon. And it worked. Apple had to back down, sign this broad licensing agreement. It effectively neutralized a major legal threat to Windows dominance. Gates weaponized his existing market position in applications to protect his future position in operating systems.
And that same kind of focused, maybe ruthless efficiency is why Microsoft ran circles around giants like IBM. Was that their joint OS2 project was a famous failure.
Yeah, there was that satirical memo that went around IBM programmers. It painted this picture of Microsoft having like 8 people rowing and 1 steering, just going flat out. While IBM, bogged down in bureaucracy, had 8 people steering and 1 rowing. And the punchline was, the recommendation for IBM was just that the 1 rower should row harder. It captures that difference, doesn't it? Microsoft's single-minded, often aggressive vision just consistently beat the slower, more committee-driven approach of the older companies. So today, data is king. And the sources point to this really profound global shift happening. We're moving from what they call the age of discovery in AI, which was largely driven by the West, to the age of implementation. And that structurally seems to favor China. Why? Because of their massive data advantage.
The sheer amount of data is obviously huge. China's got more internet users than the US and Europe combined. But the sources say it's not just quantity, it's the type of data.
Exactly. Silicon Valley companies, they mostly gather data about what we do online. Our searches, our likes, the videos we watch, where we click. Chinese tech companies, because their platforms are so integrated into daily life, payments, shopping, transport, they gather much more data about the real world, like the what, when, and where of physical purchases, meals, makeovers, and transportation. That kind of granular real-world data is incredibly valuable for training AI. Deep learning needs to see the real world to learn effectively.
And the government helps push this along incredibly fast.
Exponentially faster. The sources use the example of high-speed rail. In 2007, China had basically 0 high-speed rail. A decade later, by 2017, they had more miles of high-speed rail than the rest of the entire world put together. That kind of state-driven acceleration applied to AI and data infrastructure, it just speeds everything up: data collection, deployment, iteration. It's a massive systemic advantage. And then there's network effects, which are basically a modern form of monopoly that's really hard to challenge once it gets going. Facebook buying Instagram is the key case study. Zuckerberg paid $1 billion for Instagram back when it had, 13 employees and no revenue. No business model at all. He didn't care about the money side immediately. He knew that consolidating network strength, eliminating a potential future rival, was far more important strategically.
And analysts now look back at that deal and call it maybe the greatest regulatory failure of the past decade. Because it let Facebook just absorb a company that could have become a serious competitor down the line.
It's a perfect example of using existing scale and market power to preemptively neutralize threats. Maintaining the network dominance was the priority. You see a similar kind of strategic system optimization with Amazon and Jeff Bezos, though maybe framed differently. His long-standing effort to avoid collecting state sales tax, for instance. Internally, they apparently saw that as an enormous strategic advantage.
Right. Bezos argued it on principle, didn't he? Like, Amazon wasn't using local state services, so why should they be the state's tax collector? Kind of a libertarian argument.
Yeah, that was the public justification. But whatever the philosophy, the practical effect for years was a significant price advantage over brick-and-mortar stores that did have to collect sales tax. That advantage was crucial during Amazon's high-growth years, helping them cement their dominance before the rules eventually caught up. And then we get to the really Wild West end of modern finance, crypto, and the collapse of FTX under Sam Bankman-Fried. It feels like a culmination of exploiting regulatory gaps and, frankly, misplaced trust.
The picture painted by the sources is one of almost immediate and total breakdown of basic financial controls and transparency. There's that quote from an insider, Ramnick. FTX is smaller than people think, and Alameda is bigger. Way bigger.
Right. Alameda Research, SBF's trading firm, wasn't just some side hustle. It was this huge, high-risk quantitative trading operation. And it was borrowing billions, often from these crypto pseudo-banks like Genesis and Celsius, paying crazy high interest rates, like 6% to 20%. The level of financial risk and exposure was just enormous. And the whole setup for FTX to function the way it did apparently required exempting Alameda's traders from FTX's own internal risk management rules. The rules didn't apply to SBF's own fund, but the really direct line, the thing that looks like outright misuse of funds, was how customer money was handled. Wires from customers, money they thought they were depositing safely onto the FTX exchange. Sometimes that money didn't go to an FTX account at all. It went directly into bank accounts owned by Alameda Research, specifically this now infamous fiat@ad account.
So, customer cash. It's supposed to be segregated, safe. Instead, it's flowing straight into SBF's private hedge fund, which was making incredibly risky bets. That's the core issue, isn't it? The commingling, the potential theft. That's what ultimately brought it all crashing down.
So, while a lot of the fortunes we've discussed rely on bending rules or exploiting loopholes, we also have to acknowledge wealth built directly on, well, outright criminal activity. Fortunes that only exist because of chaos, conflict, or a total lack of governance. Victor Bout, the so-called merchant of death, he's the prime example of this.
Bout's business wasn't just selling weapons. His real edge was logistics, right?
Yep.
He controlled the transport.
Exactly. He achieved dominance because he had this unique monopoly, or near monopoly, on the air cargo capacity needed to move the vast majority of illegal arms flowing into places like Africa into conflict zones worldwide. He provided a service nobody else could or would reliably offer.
And that service directly fueled horrific conflicts and terrorism.
The intelligence reports are pretty clear. His network was suspected of supplying the weapons that enabled the RUF rebels in Sierra Leone, remember the Blood Diamonds conflict, utterly brutal. He was also linked to supplying the Taliban regime in Afghanistan and even Al-Qaeda with everything from tires to guns and ammo. It got so bad that British and Belgian intelligence launched a specific dedicated operation called Operation Bloodstone just to try and shut him down.
So his entire fortune was generated by, essentially, profiting from global instability and violence, its wealth creation as a byproduct of destruction.
Pretty much. And even after the Taliban government fell in Afghanistan, the sources say aircraft connected to Bout's network were chartered to fly gold bars and other valuables out of Pakistan, flying them to the UAE, Iran, Sudan, for what they believed were remnants of al-Qaeda trying to move assets. His business thrived on chaos. And then in a different but equally disturbing category, we have to consider someone like Jeffrey Epstein, where immense wealth wasn't just accumulated through crime, but was actively used as the tool for the crime, enabling horrific exploitation on a vast scale. His position, his access, it was definitely amplified by his connections. People like Ghislaine Maxwell, daughter of that disgraced media tycoon Robert Maxwell, she opened doors.
And the money itself became the mechanism of control, didn't it? The sources described this structured system. Abuse that escalated, Epstein's assistant scheduling appointments, offering additional monies for victims to perform certain acts or to keep coming back.
It's chilling. The payment system itself becomes part of the evidence of the crime. There's one specific, awful account in the sources. A victim being paid $1,000 right after Epstein forcibly assaulted her, and then he apologized, coldly, calculatedly. His wealth bought him the access, the social cover, the legal protection, the financial leverage over vulnerable people. It allowed him to perpetuate years and years of criminal exploitation. It shows a case where the fortune isn't just adjacent to the crime, it's fundamentally intertwined with it, essential to it.
Okay, so we've traced this, well, pretty dark history. From 19th century monopolies through gaming the political system, financial engineering, data dominance, and even outright crime. Now let's try to use a theoretical lens, specifically from the economist Thomas Piketty, to understand why. Why do these massive fortunes, once they're established, often through these compromised means, become so hard to dislodge? Why do they just keep growing?
Piketty's work on the capital-income ratio is really key here. He looked at long-term history, especially in Europe. In places like Britain and France, for centuries, going back to the 18th, 19th centuries, the total value of all the wealth in the country national capital tended to hover around 6 or 7 times the country's annual national income. Now, that ratio crashed after the World Wars because so much capital was destroyed. But, and this is crucial, it's bounced back. By around 2010, it was back up to 5 or 6 years of national income. Capital has this deep structural resilience. It tends to accumulate.
And the engine driving that accumulation, the core of Piketty's argument, is that famous inequality. The rate of return on capital tends to be consistently higher than the rate of economic growth.
Exactly. And when $3 is greater than $0, wealth that already exists grows faster than the money people earn from working and faster than the overall economy expands. Now, the average pre-tax return on capital might be around 3 to 4%, and taxes do take a bite. The average tax rate on capital income in rich countries is maybe around 30%, so individual owners see less than that raw return. But the fundamental dynamic holds. Capital, especially large pools of it, tends to compound faster than anything else, largely independent of whether the owner is actively working or innovating anymore.
And this is where that whole self-made myth really starts to fray around the edges when you're talking about extreme wealth, right?
Yeah.
When you have that initial pile built however it was built, the system itself kind of takes over the growth.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And this brings us back to what Piketty calls the apparatus of justification. He projects that if inequality keeps rising, like potentially the top 10% in the U.S. claiming 60% of national income by 2030. That's only politically sustainable if people believe it's fair, if the justification holds up. That is, if people widely believe the rich got rich and stay rich because they're just smarter or work harder or are more efficient, the meritocracy argument.
But the actual data, like looking at the Forbes billionaire lists over time, seems to contradict that neat story.
It does. The sources using that data make a clear point. Once you get past a certain very high threshold of wealth, it doesn't really matter how you got it initially, whether it was inherited, like Lillian Bettencourt's L'Oreal fortune, or built through entrepreneurship. All these massive fortunes tend to grow at extremely high rates, regardless of whether the owner of the fortune works or not. The initial act, the monopoly, the political connection, the financial maneuver, the exploitation, maybe even the crime that might have required work, or ruthlessness, or genius, or luck. That laid the foundation. But once that capital base is established and operating at scale, the system, the Dorji dynamic, largely takes over. The wealth starts to accumulate almost on autopilot. It suggests the self-made story isn't just incomplete. It often serves to hide the systemic advantages, the compromised market, the cheap labor, the regulatory loophole that were necessary to build that foundation in the first place. #outro for.
So what we've tried to do today, it isn't really about criticizing ambition or success itself. It's more about examining the structural costs that seem baked into extreme wealth concentration. We've jumped across centuries trying to connect the dots, from the, let's call them foundational sins of the Gilded Age monopolists, through the political gaming of the power brokers, the debt-fueled speculation of the financial era, and right up to the modern leverage found in data, network effects, and sometimes, outright fraud in tech and crypto.
And the thread that seems to run through it all, looking at these sources, is that huge fortunes are very rarely, maybe never, created in some kind of pure vacuum of just innovation and hard work. They seem structurally enabled. They rely heavily on bending or breaking systems, on compromising regulations, on eliminating competition, on pushing down labor costs. The real balance sheet, if you could write one, would have to include all those hidden costs, those externalities, the environmental damage, the social disruption, the debt left behind, the rules that got bent, the costs the system never actually forced the accumulator to pay.
Which leads us to a final thought, something for you to maybe chew on after this deep dive. If Piketty's right, if extreme wealth, once it's there, tends to grow at these high rates pretty much regardless of ongoing effort thanks to Schur's being greater than ours, then how should we, as a society, think about the difference between wealth that comes from genuine innovation that actually makes the whole pie bigger for everyone, and wealth that comes mainly from just getting really, really good at optimizing or maybe exploiting systems that are primarily designed to concentrate capital in the first place?
Yeah, where is that line? What's the, I guess, the moral threshold for systemic optimization? When does gaming the system become fundamentally different from creating real value? And looking forward, how do we maybe adjust the rules of the game now to ensure that the next wave of immense fortunes doesn't just rely on repeating the same patterns, the same fundamental injustices or regulatory failures that built so many fortunes of the past? That's the question we'll leave you with.